Ontario released its 2026 budget on Thursday. It is 231 pages. It projects a $13.8 billion in deficit, an accumulated debt on track to exceed $500 billion, and a return to balanced book in theory by 2029. That raises a straightforward question. Can Ontario actually afford what this budget promises? And what are the real trade-offs buried in the numbers? Today, we work through four things: the deficit and what opened it, the debt and what it costs in practical terms, what happened to the hospital funding, and why the housing market is now so weak that a major developer is covering buyers' mortgage payments for a full year. Let's start with the number that defines the documents. Ontario's deficit for 2027 is $13.8 billion. Last fall, the province projected roughly $7.8 billion. That is a gap of $6 billion that opened in 6 months. The government attributes the difference primarily to US tariff impact and an economic slowdown. Ontario grew just 1.2% last year. It is forecasted to grow 1% this year, less than a half the rate projected for the United States. Critics argue the shortfall also reflects a deliberate revenue choices. The elimination of license plate fees, gas tax cuts, road toll removals that reduce the province's fiscal cushion before economic headwinds arrived. Toronto Star column makes this case explicitly. It also notes that Finance Minister has consistently projected higher deficits and delivered lower ones. Last year's projection of $14.6 billion is now estimated to come in at $12.3 billion. Both explanations contain evidence. The question of how much weight to give each is a political one. The economic slowdown behind the deficit is not abstract. Ontario's unemployment rate rose to 7.7% last year and is forecasted to remain at 7.4% this year. The budget document itself acknowledges that youth unemployment has reached levels not seen outside the pandemic in decades. The budget also shows Ontario's balanced book are not expected until 2029. That is a year later than the province previously projected. That projection assumes economic conditions that are genuinely uncertain, particularly the trajectory of US-Canada trade relations. The province is projecting economic growth of 1.7% for 2026. 6 months ago, it was projecting 1.9%. Each downward revision reflects conditions that are deteriorating faster than the government's model anticipated. Now, what is the cumulative effect of running these deficits? That takes us to the debt. Ontario's accumulated taxpayer-supported debt is on track to reach $540 billion by 2028. Divided by Ontario's population, it's roughly $30,000 per person. When the Ford government took office in 2018, the figure was around $23,000 per person. It has increased by roughly $7,000 per Ontarian over 8 years. The practical consequence of that debt is the cost of servicing it. Interest payments on Ontario's debt are projected to rise from $15 billion to $19.7 billion in 2029, a 30% increase in 4 years. In the current budget, debt servicing will cost $17.2 billion. That is a 6.7 cents of every tax dollar collected money that cannot go to services. The government points out that Ontario's debt servicing ratio is lower than the federal government's equivalent. That is accurate. But what the budget also reveals is that Ontario now spends more on debt interest than something specific. In the 2026-2027 Ontario budget, the debt servicing costs $17.2 billion. Post-secondary education, all of Ontario universities and colleges cost $13.8 billion. Ontario is spending more on interest payments than on the entire post-secondary system. For context, healthcare is the largest expenditure at $101.2 billion, 41% of the total budget. Education overall is $40.8 billion. Social services come in at 8.8%. Debt servicing at 6.7% is the fourth largest item. The Toronto Sun's Brian Lilly notes the headline health number. The Ford government has increased health spending from $62.2 billion when it took office in 2018 to $101.2 billion today, a 63% increase, and Ontario will exceed $100 billion in health spending for the first time. Whether those increases increases were sufficient is where the healthcare story gets specific. Before the budget was released, the Ontario Hospital Association, which represents 135 hospital corporations, said its members were in dire financial straits. It needs nearly $2.8 billion just to stabilize the hospital sector. The budget allocated $1.1 billion for the hospitals next fiscal year. That is a gap of $1.7 billion between what the sector said it needs to stabilize and what it received. The government's position: health spending has grown by 63% since 2018. Total spending will exceed $100 billion for the first time. The budget also includes $186 million in additional autism programs funding, $1.1 billion for home cares over 3 years. The hospital sector's position that growth hasn't kept pace with population increases, post-pandemic demand, and inflation in healthcare costs. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. The gap between $2.8 billion and $1.1 billion is the number that will manifest in wait times, bed availability over the next year. 3 other budget items are worth noting because they reveal the direction of this government in its 3rd term. First, the budget reiterates a plan to introduce legislation exempting the Premier's office, cabinet ministers, and parliamentary assistants from freedom of information laws. In practice, that would make the Premier's emails, government documents, and cell phone records inaccessible through public access requests. The government has not offered a detailed public justification for the change. Second, a $4 billion Protect Ontario investment fund to be run with a private sector partner, targeting sectors the government considers strategic, including AI, biotech, and advanced manufacturing. Brian Lilly in the Toronto Sun notes this represents a significant shift. The Ford government of 2018 wanted to get governments out of the way of businesses. Today, it is explicitly picking sectors to invest in. Third, the fieldwork begins this spring on a feasibility study for a tunnel expressway under Highway 401, a project whose eventually costs, if built, would run into the tens of billions. Alongside the budget, a parallel story about the housing market connects to some of what the government is trying to address. Mattamy Homes, one of Canada's largest home builders, announced last week it could cover mortgage payments for up to 1 year builds in Calgary and Edmonton, an incentive capped at roughly $50,000. The company's vice president of sales said this directly. It was born in part out of need. The reasoning is instructive. A $50,000 price cut on a home only reduces a monthly mortgage payments by about $100 over 30 years. Not enough to move hesitant buyers. Covering 12 months of payments addresses the cash flow barrier directly. That's what's holding buyers back. Other developers are running similar offers. Property taxes covered for a year in London, Ontario. Maintenance fees covered for 2 years at a Burlington townhouse complex. Toronto area brokers say developers' incentives on the ownership side are significantly more common now than they were 12 to 24 months ago. Economist at the University of Ottawa's Missing Middle initiative explains the structural reason behind the incentive trends. Sellers of the existing homes can lower their asking price all the way down to what buyers are willing to accept. New construction is different. There is a price floor set by the construction costs. Go below it and development stops being economically viable. So developers get creative instead. Against that backdrop, the 2026 Ontario's budget's housing measures is relevant. The province is temporarily expanding its HST rebate on new homes to all buyers, not just first-time home buyers, on homes up to $1.5 million. Combined with the federal first-time home buyers GST and HST rebates, the maximum combined relief reaches $130,000 on homes up to $1 million. Whether that tax relief is sufficient to move buyers who are sitting on the fence due to economic uncertainty is a question the market will answer over the coming quarters. If it works, we will see it in the housing starts data. If it doesn't, the developer incentive trend will likely intensify. 5 things are worth tracking as this budget plays out. 1. Whether the deficit comes in lower than $13.8 billion, the finance minister's track record suggests it might, but that depends on the trade conditions and economic growth holding up. 2. The hospital capacity over the next fiscal year. The $1.7 billion gap between what was needed and what was received will show up in emergency wait times, surgical backlogs, and bed availability. Those are measurable outcomes. 3. Whether the FOI exemption legislation moves forward and what scopes it takes. 4. Housing market activity in response to the combined federal and provincial rebates. New home sales data over the next 2 quarters will tell us whether the intervention worked. And 5. The $4 billion investment fund, who the private partner is and what it invests in will reveal whether this is a serious industrial policy tool or a political one. All the sources for this episode are in the description. We do this every Monday. I'll see you then. A quick disclaimer. This content is produced for information and entertainment purposes only. All the facts are drawn from publicly available sources cited in the video description. Viewers are encouraged to verify information independently and form their own informed opinions. Canadian Politics Unplugged is not affiliated with any political party, government body, or special interest groups. Views expressed are those of the host only. Sources for this episode are in the description. Thank you for watching.